New Orleans in the 1800s was unlike any other city in America, a place where French, Spanish, African, and American cultures collided in a swirl of music, commerce, and unrest. By mid-century, it was home to over 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the nation and the busiest port in the South. The air smelled of coffee, sugar, and the Mississippi River. The streets echoed with half a dozen languages. This was a city built on trade, shaped by slavery, and alive with contradiction. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, engravings, and prints to life, allowing us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through the same scenes in ways their original artists never could. What you're seeing isn't imagination, it's reconstruction, based on the real visual records left behind by artists who walk these streets. First, I want to talk about the French Quarter. This is the French Quarter. This view shows the heart of old New Orleans, stretching back from the Mississippi River in a tight grid of narrow streets and iron-lace balconies. By the early 1800s, the Quarter or Via Carré was already over a century old. The buildings were low, mostly 2 or 3 stories, built of brick covered in stucco. Their walls were painted in faded yellows, pinks, and greens. Wrought iron balconies hung overhead, dripping with ferns and shadows. Down below, the streets were packed. Creole merchants in linen suits haggled in French. American traders barked in English. Enslaved people carried baskets of oysters, vegetables, and linens on their heads, calling out prices. The smell was overwhelming: rotting fish, blooming jasmines, sweat, and horse manure. But the Quarter was also dangerous. Yellow fever swept through almost every summer, killing thousands. The disease arrived with ships from the Caribbean and spread fast in the heat. Wealthy families fled to plantations upriver. The poor had nowhere to go. Bodies piled up in the streets during the worst outbreaks, like the epidemic of 1853, which killed over 8,000 people, yet the Quarter was essential. This was where business happened, where ships were insured, where cotton deals were made. The wealth of the South flowed through these streets. By the late 1800s, the Quarter began to decay. Wealthier residents moved to newer neighborhoods uptown. Buildings fell into disrepair, but the bones remained. Today, the French Quarter is the most famous neighborhood in New Orleans. The same iron balconies still hang overhead, though now they're polished and the streets are full of tourists. This view shows the Mississippi River levee here. We're standing on the riverfront, looking out over a scene of constant motion. By the 1800s, the levee, the raised embankment along the river, was the economic engine of the city. Steamboats lined the waterfront, dozens of them, their smokestacks black against the sky. Bales of cotton were stacked 10 feet high, waiting to be loaded. Barrels of sugar, molasses, and rum crowded the docks. The noise was deafening. Steam whistles shrieked. Dockworkers shouted. Chains clanked as cargo swung through the air. Most of the labor was done by enslaved men, sweating under the brutal Louisiana sun. They hauled, lifted, and loaded from dawn until dark. Accidents were common. Men were crushed by falling bales or lost fingers in the machinery. No one kept count. The river itself was wide, brown, and fast-moving. It carried everything: commerce, disease, opportunity, and danger. Flooding was a constant threat. The levees were built higher every few years, but the river always pushed back. In 1849, a levee break upriver sent water pouring into parts of the city. Homes were destroyed. Crops were ruined. Yet the river was why New Orleans existed. It connected the interior of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico and the wider world. Cotton grown in Mississippi and Tennessee came down the river and left from these docks. New Orleans grew rich on the labor of others. By the late 1800s, railroads began to compete with river traffic. The riverfront declined. The steamboat era was ending. Today, the levee is a public park. A few steamboats still offer tourist cruises, but the cargo is gone. This is Jackson Square. This view shows the elegant plaza at the heart of the French Quarter, surrounded by 3 sides by arcaded buildings and facing the river on the 4th. By the 1800s, this square, originally called the Place d'Armes, had become a gathering place for everyone. At the center stood an equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson, erected in 1856 to honor the general who defended New Orleans in the Battle of 1815. The square was always busy. Artists sold sketches. Street performers played fiddles and drums. Vendors hawked pralines and lemonade. Children chased pigeons across the flagstones. In the background, the towers of St. Louis Cathedral rose in white stucco, flanked by the Cabildo and the Presbyter government buildings left over from Spanish rule. But the square had darker purposes too. Before the Civil War, this was a site for slave auctions. Men, women, and children were bought and sold in the shadow of the cathedral. Families were separated, lives were destroyed. The wealth of the city was built on their bodies. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Jackson Square became a symbol of Reconstruction. Union soldiers camped nearby. Freed people gathered here, testing their new freedom. But violence simmered. White supremacists resisted change. By the 1870s, Reconstruction was collapsing under the weight of terror and political betrayal. The square witnessed all of its celebration, suffering, resistance, and loss. Today, Jackson Square is a National Historic Landmark. Street artists still sell their work along the iron fence, and tourists pose in front of the statue. The cathedral remains. This view shows Canal Street. Here we see the widest street in the city, cutting a diagonal line between the French Quarter and the American sector. By the 1830s, Canal Street had become the dividing line literally and culturally. On one side, the Creoles spoke French and clung to old customs. On the other, the Americans built banks, hotels, and businesses in a new, aggressive style. The street itself was enormous, over 170 feet wide. Streetcars rattled down the center by the 1830s, some of the first in the nation. Pedestrians dodged horses and carts. Gas lamps were installed in the 1840s, turning the street into a glowing corridor at night. Shops lined both sides: dry goods, tailors, jewelers, saloons. But Canal Street was also a border. Rivalries between Creoles and Americans sometimes turned violent. Different legal systems, different languages, different power structures collided here. The city was even briefly divided into 3 separate municipalities in the 1830s because the two groups couldn't govern together. Commerce won in the end. By mid-century, Canal Street was the most valuable commercial real estate in the South. The line between Creole and American began to blur. Money spoke louder than language. During the Civil War, Union forces occupied New Orleans in 1862. Federal troops marched down Canal Street, tearing down Confederate flags. The city spent the rest of the war under military rule, spared destruction, but simmering with resentment. By the late 1800s, Canal Street was lined with grand department stores and theaters. The city's wealth was on display. Today, Canal Street remains a major thoroughfare, though much quieter. The streetcar still runs. This is the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. This view shows the oldest surviving cemetery in New Orleans, just outside the French Quarter. By the early 1800s, this city of the dead was already crowded. The tombs were built above ground, white stucco crypts stacked like small houses, arranged in rows. The reason was water. New Orleans sits below sea level. Dig 6 feet down and you hit the water table. Bodies couldn't stay buried. So the dead were placed in ovens, small chambers sealed with marble slabs. The heat of the Louisiana sun turned each tomb into a furnace, speeding decomposition. After a year and a day, the remains were pushed to the back and the tomb was reused. Families could share a crypt for generations. Walking through the cemetery was like walking through a maze. The narrow passages between tombs were shadowed and silent. Weeds grew from cracks, paint peeled in the humidity. The smell was dust and old stone. But this was also sacred ground. Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, was said to be buried here, though her exact tomb is disputed. By the mid-1800s, her legend was already growing. People left offerings, coins, flowers, chalk marks, hoping for her blessing or her curse. The cemetery was also a reflection of the city's divisions. Wealthy families had elaborate tombs with carved angels. The poor were buried in wall vaults, simple slots in long communal walls. Even in death, class mattered. By the late 1800s, larger cemeteries were built farther from the center. St. Louis No. 1 became less active, more historic. Today, it's one of the most visited sites in New Orleans. Tours are required for entry, and the tomb of Marie Laveau is covered in X marks left by visitors. This view shows the French market. Here we're standing in the long open-air market stretching along the river near the old town. By the 1800s, the French market was the most vibrant and chaotic marketplace in the South. Stalls lined both sides of the covered arcade. Vendors sold everything: fresh fish, chickens, vegetables, spices, coffee, handmade baskets and charms. The crowd was a mix of everyone. Creole women in bright tignon headscarves, free people of color, enslaved people running errands for their owners, German immigrants, Irish dockworkers, sailors from a dozen countries. The languages blended into a roar. The air was thick with the smell of cayenne, raw meat, and the river. Fights broke out over prices. Pickpockets worked the crowd. The city guard patrolled half-heartedly, but the market was essential. This was where the city ate. Without it, New Orleans would starve. Free women of color dominated much of the trade. They ran stalls, sold goods, and controlled their own income unusual in a society built on slavery. Some became wealthy, but their freedom was fragile. Laws constantly threatened to restrict them. White resentment was always present. During the Civil War, food became scarce. The Union blockade strangled the city. Prices soared. The market stayed open, but the shelves were often bare. By the late 1800s, the market was modernized. Iron sheds replaced some of the old wooden structures, but the spirit remained. Today, the French market is still operating, though it's now mostly cafes and souvenir shops. You can still walk the same covered arcade, though the chickens are gone. This is Tremé. This view shows the neighborhood just north of the French Quarter, one of the oldest African-American communities in the nation. By the early 1800s, Tremé was home to a large population of free people of color, skilled tradespeople, musicians, business owners. They lived in modest wooden cottages painted in bright colors, with narrow porches and shuttered windows. This was where culture was born. Brass bands played in the streets. African drumming traditions survived and evolved. The roots of jazz were being planted here, though the music wouldn't have that name for decades. On Sundays, enslaved and free people gathered in Congo Square, just at the edge of Tremé, to dance, drum, and sing. It was one of the few places where African traditions were openly practiced. But Tremé was also vulnerable. Free people of color lived under constant surveillance. Laws restricted where they could go, what they could wear, and whom they could associate with. White authorities feared their independence. After the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, paranoia about black rebellion intensified. After the Civil War, Tremé became a center of Reconstruction politics. Black voters organized here. Schools were opened. Churches became meeting halls. But white supremacists struck back. The Colfax Massacre in 1873, though outside the city, sent a clear message. By the 1890s, Jim Crow laws were erasing the progress. Tremé endured. The music continued. The community held on. Today, Tremé is recognized as the birthplace of jazz. Congo Square is a historic site. The neighborhood has struggled with gentrification, but the spirit remains. This view shows the Garden District here. We're standing in a neighborhood that didn't exist until the Americans arrived. By the 1830s, wealthy American merchants and planters were building grand mansions upriver from the French Quarter in what had been plantation land. The Garden District was their answer to the Creole, elite bigger, showier, more modern. The houses were stunning. Greek Revival mansions with towering white columns, Italianate villas with wide verandas, yards filled with magnolias, oaks, and azaleas. Iron fences enclosed private gardens. The wealth was impossible to miss. These were the homes of cotton brokers, sugar planters, and slave traders. Fortunes built on the labor of others were displayed in marble and mahogany. Enslaved people cooked, cleaned, and maintained the estates, invisible except when needed. The streets were wide and tree-lined, deliberately designed to feel spacious and open the opposite of the cramped French Quarter. Streetcars connected the district to downtown by the 1850s, making it easy for businessmen to commute. But the Civil War shattered the illusion. Many of these families lost everything when the Confederacy fell and slavery ended. Some held on, others sold. The district began a slow decline. By the late 1800s, the Garden District was still prestigious, but quieter. The age of plantation wealth was over. Today, the Garden District is one of the most sought-after neighborhoods in New Orleans. The mansions are restored and protected. You can walk the same oak-lined streets and glimpse the gardens behind the gates. This is the Battle of New Orleans site. This view shows the flat, marshy ground southeast of the city, where one of the strangest battles in American history took place on January 8, 1815. Andrew Jackson commanded a ragtag mix of American soldiers, free black militiamen, Choctaw warriors, pirates, and frontier sharpshooters. They faced a professional British army of over 8,000 men, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. The British advanced in tight formation across open ground. American cannons and rifles tore them apart. The battle lasted less than an hour. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The Americans lost fewer than 100. It was a stunning, lopsided victory. The irony was bitter. The War of 1812 had already ended. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed 2 weeks earlier, but news traveled slowly. The battle was fought for nothing yet. It made Jackson a national hero and shaped American identity for decades. The site itself was forgettable. Muddy fields, a canal, a few scattered buildings. After the battle, it returned to farmland. Veterans came back to mark the spot. Monuments were raised, but the drama faded. By the late 1800s, the area was being developed. The battlefield was mostly forgotten. Today, the Chalmette battlefield is a national historical park. You can walk the ground where the British fell and imagine the smoke and noise of that January morning. This view shows a cotton press warehouse here. We're inside one of the massive warehouses where cotton bales were compressed before shipping. By the mid-1800s, New Orleans handled more cotton than any port in the world. The bales arrived by riverboat and were hauled into these dim, cavernous buildings. The air was thick with cotton dust. The noise was constant machinery groaning, men shouting, bales dropping onto the floor. The work was brutal. Enslaved men and Irish immigrants did the heaviest labor, working side by side in dangerous conditions. The presses were powered by steam or mules, squeezing bales down to half their size so more could fit on ships. Fires were a constant risk. Cotton dust was explosive. A single spark could ignite the whole building. But this was where fortunes were made. Cotton was king. The global textile industry depended on southern cotton, and New Orleans was the gateway. Brokers and merchants grew rich without ever touching a bale themselves. After the Civil War, the cotton trade continued, but under new conditions. Slavery was gone, replaced by sharecropping and wage labor that still left black workers trapped in poverty. The warehouses stayed busy. By the early 1900s, the cotton trade began to shift. New ports and new crops changed the economy. The warehouses slowly emptied. Today, many of the old cotton warehouses have been converted into apartments, offices, or event spaces. The machinery is gone, but the brick walls remember. This is Storyville. This view shows the infamous red light district, officially established in 1897 just north of the French Quarter. By the late 1800s, prostitution was rampant in New Orleans, and city leaders decided to contain it. An alderman named Sidney Story proposed concentrating all legal prostitution in a designated zone. The area became known, to his horror, as Storyville. The district was a mix of lavish brothels and shabby cribs. Wealthy madams ran elegant houses with crystal chandeliers, velvet curtains, and live music. Women in cheaper establishments worked in single rooms, standing in doorways to attract customers. The Blue Book, a printed guide, listed the options like a menu. Storyville was where early jazz found an audience. Pianists like Jelly Roll Morton played in the brothels. Brass bands paraded through the streets. The music was raw, improvisational, alive, and it was born in a place most respectable people refused to acknowledge. But Storyville was also exploitation. Many of the women were poor, trapped by circumstance or coercion. Disease was rampant. Violence was common. The authorities looked the other way as long as the money flowed. In 1917, the US Navy demanded the district be closed because it was near a military base. Storyville was shut down almost overnight. The buildings were demolished or repurposed. The women scattered. Today, almost nothing remains of Storyville. A few streets still bear the same names, but the neighborhood is unrecognizable. The music is what survived. Closing New Orleans in the 1800s was a city of extremes, astonishing wealth, built on enslaved labor, beauty coexisting with disease, music rising from suffering. Walking its streets, you would have heard a dozen languages, smelled jasmine and rot in the same breath, and felt the weight of a culture too complex to belong to one country or one people. What strikes me most is how much of that complexity is still there. The architecture remains, the music echoes. The contradictions haven't gone away, they've just changed shape. New Orleans holds its history close, sometimes too close, but it never lets go. If there's another city, another moment, or another scene you'd like me to reconstruct, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what draws you to the past. Again, thank you so much.